The offer curve, also known as the reciprocal demand curve, is a fundamental tool in international economics that graphically represents a country's willingness to trade. It shows the quantities of one commodity, exports, that a country will offer in exchange for various quantities of another commodity, imports, at different possible international price ratios, terms of trade. Offer curve and exchange equilibrium. The exchange equilibrium in a two-country, two-commodity model is determined by the intersection of the two countries' offer curves. Offer curve, derived from a country's production possibilities frontier and community indifference curves. It traces all the optimal combinations of exports and imports a country is willing to trade as the international price ratio, terms of trade, changes. It typically bulges toward the axis of the commodity the country exports, reflecting an increasing willingness to trade as the price of its export good rises relative to its import good, up to a point. Exchange equilibrium. This occurs at the point where the two countries' offer curves intersect. At this point, the quantity of the export good demanded by one country equals the quantity supplied by the other and vice versa. This intersection determines the equilibrium volume of trade and the equilibrium international terms of trade, the slope of the line from the origin to the intersection point. The terms of trade and real income. Terms of trade, TOT, the ratio of a country's export prices to its import prices. Mathematically, T equals frac P underscore export P underscore import. In the offer curve diagram, the TOT is represented by the slope of a ray from the origin to a point on the offer curve. An improvement in a country's TOT, a steeper ray for the exporting country, means it can obtain a larger quantity of imports for a given quantity of exports. A deterioration in TOT, a flatter ray, means it receives a smaller quantity of imports for the same quantity of exports. Real income, welfare. Trade enables a country to consume on a higher community indifference curve than its autarky, no trade consumption level, representing a gain in real income. The final consumption point for a country after trade is determined by the point on its offer curve corresponding to the equilibrium TOT. This point will lie on the highest possible community indifference curve tangent to the equilibrium TOT line. An improvement in the TOT, all else equal, generally shifts the consumption point to a higher indifference curve, thus increasing the country's real income. A deterioration lowers real income. Stability of the exchange equilibrium. The stability of the exchange equilibrium is assessed by considering what happens when the actual terms of trade deviate from the equilibrium TOT. An equilibrium is stable if a temporary displacement of the TOT creates forces, excess supply or excess demand, that push the TOT back toward the equilibrium level. Marshall-Lerner condition. In offer curve context, the stability of equilibrium is ensured if the sum of the elasticities of the two countries' offer curves is greater than unity at the intersection point. If the actual TOT is above the equilibrium TOT, there will be an excess supply of one country's export good and excess demand for the others, which will cause the price of the export excess supply good to fall relative to the other, moving the TOT back to equilibrium. Unstable equilibrium can occur if the offer curves have unusual, highly inelastic or backward bending shapes, which would cause disequilibrium to be self-reinforcing. Comparative statics. Comparative statics analysis uses shifts in the offer curves to study the effects of changes in economic conditions on the equilibrium TOT and trade volume. A. Inter-country transfer. This involves a unidirectional transfer of income, e.g., foreign aid, war reparations from one country, the donor, to another, the recipient. Offer curve shift. The donor country's offer curve shifts inwards. It is less willing to trade for a given TOT, and the recipient country's offer curve shifts outwards. It is more willing to trade. Impact on TOT. The effect depends on the marginal propensity to spend on the traded goods in both countries. If the donor has a higher marginal propensity to spend on its own goods, the goods it exports, than the recipient, the TOT of the donor country will deteriorate. It will pay the transfer in part through a less favorable TOT. If the recipient has a higher marginal propensity to spend on the donor's goods, the TOT of the donor country will improve. A favorable change in TOT for the donor is needed to balance the trade. The case where the TOT remains unchanged is known as the normal case, or classical condition, where the transfer is effected entirely by a change in trade volume without a change in the TOT. B. Import substitution. This is a policy, like tariffs or quotas, aimed at reducing imports by encouraging domestic production of import-competing goods. Offer curve shift. The country implementing import substitution becomes less willing to import for any given quantity of exports. Its offer curve shifts inwards. Impact on TOT. The reduction in import demand by the implementing country will improve its TOT, make its exports relatively more valuable. This is because the world demand for the other country's goods, its imports, decreases. C. Export-led growth and the possibility of immiserization. Export-led growth, ELG, is an economic strategy focusing on increasing the volume of exports to drive economic growth, often due to an increase in the production capacity of the export sector. Offer curve shift. The growing country's offer curve shifts outwards, indicating its willingness to offer more exports for the same quantity of imports, or the same quantity of exports for fewer imports, i.e., it's willing to trade more. Impact on TOT. The large increase in the supply of exports on the world market tends to deteriorate the growing country's TOT, making its exports cheaper. Immiserizing growth. This is a theoretical possibility where the negative welfare effect from the deterioration of the TOT is so strong that it outweighs the positive welfare effect from the increase in production capacity. The country's real income decreases despite its economic growth. This is more likely if 1. The country's growth is heavily concentrated in its export sector. 2. The country has a dominant share in the world market for its export good. 3. The foreign demand for its exports is price inelastic, so a large increase in export volume results in a disproportionately large drop in price. Gains from trade. Trade generates gains from trade for both participating countries, as illustrated by the shift from the autarky consumption point to a higher consumption point on a higher community indifference curve after trade commences. The total gain from trade can be decomposed into two components. 1. Gains from exchange. The ability to trade at an international price ratio, TOT, that is more favorable than the domestic autarky price ratio, allowing the country to reach a higher indifference curve even without changing its production. 2. Gains from specialization or production. The ability to reallocate resources and specialize production in the good, where the country has a comparative advantage, further increasing the potential for exports and allowing the country to reach an even higher indifference curve. The distribution of the gains from trade between the two countries is directly related to the equilibrium terms of trade. The country whose final TOT is closer to the other country's autarky price ratio, and thus farther from its own autarky price ratio, captures the larger share of the gains from trade.